Hi everyone, English 4113, class 16, the first of three classes on Olympe Equiano's The Interesting Narrative. So as I told you in class, it's not unusual for this work to be called The Interesting Narrative. There are lots of books in the 18th century with that title. So please don't get hung up on that. We're going to talk about this particular page in class. I just want you to note the various ways that Equiano is engaged in an act of self-possession, whether it's in presenting two names, the names that he was forced to bear as an enslaved man, Gustavus Vasa, or the name that he claims for himself as his African name, Olympe Equiano, where he puts the African in that, Olympe Equiano or Gustavus Vasa, the African. That's quite interesting itself. So just give some thought to that before class tomorrow. So let me just return to something I was talking about on Tuesday. I promised you that I would do some research into this. So we have this statement from the playwright and feminist thinker Olympe de Gorges in her reflection on Negro men, February 1788, where she is complaining to the Comédie Française that they have not put on her play about Black people. It's her abolitionist play. And she says that she wants it to be staged, and she imagines that it's going to be staged effectively in blackface. And I was raising the question of whether or not we can understand this as being the same as derogatory blackface. And the class generally agreed that it was probably better not to have more blackface in the world. It's better to have as little as possible. And I said, well, were there actually Black performers available in 18th century Paris? Would that have actually, the lack of those performers have stymied the ability to put this play on? And so I looked into this some more, and I remembered some things about Black artists in 18th century Paris and also in 19th century Paris that's important. And so I just wanted to share with you what I found in my research, which is going to certainly shift me very much in the direction of the conversation among you and away from my own opinion. So we have, of course, these two composers and musicians. We've got George Bridgetower, 1779. So he's born quite late in the 18th century, dies in 1840. He is here in the middle, and he is the dedicatee of Beethoven's Kreutzer Sonata. At least he's the first dedicatee, and then Beethoven seems to have cut that dedication out perhaps because he and Bridgetower were arguing about a woman. But he's a musician and a violinist and did quite well for himself as that in Europe. And he's also, there's kind of a historical novel / poem written by Rita Dove called the Sonata Muletica, which is what Beethoven first called his Kreutzer Sonata. So you can read the story of George Bridgetower in poetic form in a book by Rita Dove. It's quite short, it's very good. And then we have this fellow on the far right, who's Joseph de Boulogne, who's also the Chevalier de Saint-Georges. So he's born in Guadeloupe in 1745 and dies in 1799 in Paris. And like Bridgetower, he's the son of a Black parent and a white parent. In this case, his father, who's a white French aristocrat, is unusually decided to recognize his son as a legitimate son, even though his mother was enslaved. And because of that, Joseph de Boulogne had a very good education and eventually moved to France, as his father had to go back to France because he killed a man in a duel, and there was some trouble around that. And Joseph de Boulogne was trained as a fencer. He was very good at it. He was very good at all sports. And then he became an expert violinist and was an extremely good violinist, and met and talked to Mozart, who Mozart more or less ripped off some of his music. And he worked with Franz Joseph Haydn, who is one of the most famous musicians of his day. And he did a number of other really impressive things. He was attacked a couple times for his abolitionist and revolutionary views and managed to defeat his attackers because he was an expert swordsman. I think someone's making a movie about his life, actually. And in terms of what would have been available, for Olympe de Gorges to draw on for actors? Well, one thing that came to mind is that Joseph de Boulogne led an all-Black regiment during the French Revolution. So this is hundreds of Black men that he's leading as their military leader, and they're fighting against the Royalists. And certainly, I imagine Olympe de Gorges could have found somebody among those people, probably Joseph de Boulogne himself, who certainly could have convincingly acted on the stage of the Comédie Française. So that's on her. She wasn't looking hard enough. I'm also just want to mention, in terms of Black writers in European culture in this period or the decades following, there is, just in terms of French, the first anthology of Black poetry, a work called Les Senelles. Senelle is a holly or hawthorn berry, is published in New Orleans in 1845. So this is the very first anthology of Black poetry in print, and it's published in America, actually. And as anti-Black laws worsened in the US, in New Orleans, for example, in the 1850s, there's a requirement that free Black people had to register and decide who their master was going to be. They're no longer allowed to be free. And so people who had the money and means to leave did leave. And so someone like Victor Séjour, who's a rich Black man from New Orleans, moves to France and stays there, I believe, for the rest of his life, writes an abolitionist short story called The Mulatto in French, and also writes plays and is quite successful. And his plays are not particularly explicitly abolitionist, but people like to read them as if they were. But you should just be aware of these writers. So I do think, finally, in the colonies, in the French colonies, of course, you could find Black actors and Black performers. So here's a book by Lauren R. Clay, Stage Struck, The Business of Theater in 18th Century France and its Colonies. And she talks about cities in Haiti where there are Black performers, of course, who are free, singing in the chorus, acting on stage. There was a star, a woman named Minette, and also her sister Lisa, who were mixed race performers who were stars, and they would have been paid extremely well if they weren't being ripped off by their managers, which is a common story in performance. But we also have in mid-18th century Haiti, as I read in this article by Peter P. Reed, The Life of Death of Anna Gardy, American Theater, Refugee Dramas, and the Spectre of the Haitian Revolution, an article from 2016. We actually have white performers in blackface in Haiti in the mid-18th century. So with all that in mind, I think that Olympe de Gorges could have found Black people who were capable of acting, who were Black, on the stage, so that we don't need to have blackface in 18th century Paris for a number of reasons, including the fact that there were Black people who were probably perfectly capable of acting. And then if we look to the colonies in the same period, we do have Black actors who are making a relatively good living, not as good as they should, on stage. But we also have literal derogatory blackface being employed in the middle of the 18th century already in the colonies. So with all that in mind, I need to revise my views about Olympe de Gorges. So that's how this works. And so thank you for pushing me in that direction. Now, we're going deep into transatlantic slavery for the rest of the semester. And I want you to be aware of this important book, Orlando Patterson's Slavery and Social Death. It's extremely long, and I am correcting something in my life by reading it for the first time right now. So this is my bedtime reading. And Orlando Patterson, who was born in Jamaica and has in 1940, and is one of the most distinguished historians of slavery that we have, argues crucially in this book that the key features of slavery in a comparative sense, so he's looked basically all the way from the ancient Greeks to hundreds of African cultures, to Korea, to the Americas, basically everywhere where there's slavery and everywhere there's human civilization, there's been slavery. And he says the three key features of being enslaved is powerlessness. You have no social power, you have no ability to enact your will if other people are trying to resist it. There's a lack of honor. A slave cannot be dishonored. They have no honor. There's no way to humiliate them. There already is humiliated as they possibly can be. And then the other key feature of being enslaved is natal alienation, which we're going to see in Equiano, we're going to see talked about in Toni Morrison's Beloved, which is you're cut off from all personal family ties. You have no more relationship to your parents. You have no relationship to your children. Your children are, you may be able to bear children, but you have no right to them, and you have no right to your spouse. You can be separated from them, and nobody is going to fight back in your favor, right? If you're separated from your wife or from your husband or from your children or from your parents. Natal alienation and cultural alienation are key features of slavery. Now, when people ask, well, what does it mean to be enslaved? The typical answer is being your property and you're sold. And Orlando Patterson says, yes, these are necessary conditions of being enslaved, but they're not sufficient. And he brings up a number of examples of free people whose relationship to other people is one of being property. And classically, this is a really often a relationship of husband and wife, or even cases of people being sold who engage in otherwise free labor. And he offers the example of professional athletes. And we can maybe argue about that a bit in class, whether or not you're convinced by that. But he's got some, I think, more convincing examples from Chinese history. So these are things to keep in mind. Powerlessness, lack of honor, natal alienation. Look for these qualities in Equiano's interesting narrative and have them in mind, especially when we're reading Beloved. Okay, so moving on to Equiano. You may want to pause this slide and just examine it. One thing to be aware of is that he's one of the best traveled men of the 18th century, travels arguably from West Africa. I'll talk about what that arguably means in class. Of course, to the Americas, throughout the Caribbean, on the Mosquito Coast here, up into North America, up into Canada, all through the Mediterranean. He goes as far as Turkey, so we don't even have that displayed here. He's here in Spain, of course. He moves throughout the British Isles and nearly goes to the North Pole. This man goes everywhere. He is a sailor. He's an expert sailor. First forced to become put on a ship, but eventually he becomes extremely good at this job. And he leaves it only because after he's free, people, white Englishmen, keep trying to re-enslave him. I think he would have been perfectly content to be a sailor for the rest of his life had that not happened. So the thing with Equiano, as I've just alluded to, is that people are constantly trying to re-enslave him. We typically, in narrative, expect a narrative to start maybe with someone in a condition of happiness and to move into a condition of unhappiness and then move into a higher condition of happiness at the end. This is the classic narrative trajectory of like a biopic, a movie about the life of a person, or a documentary, where we often say have a musician or performer who eventually moves to success, and then because of various financial problems or problems with drug abuse, loses status and happiness, and eventually regains it at the end, because every documentary has to end in a happy way. That kind of trajectory is something we're not going to find in Equiano, not in a clear sense. It is a trauma narrative, Kathy Davidson argues, in which survival is conditional and victory temporary and partial. Anything good can vanish in an instant. Even tragedy is unpredictable. It's the antithesis of Christological journeys such as the Pilgrim's Progress, since Equiano has to relearn the same lessons over and over without much hope of salvation. Any moment that he's happy, that happiness can be taken away from him. It's very difficult for him to plan for tomorrow, because any present moment he's in danger of being re-enslaved. You imagine that when he becomes free, that this is going to open up entirely new worlds to him, but in fact, it opens up a new world of extraordinary frustration. Where does this come from? Well, Kathy Davidson says, quite rightly, because he's Black, there's little he can do about it. And the best theorist of this problem of Blackness and a lack of narrative trajectory or a narrative arc is, again, Frank Wilderson's book, Afro-Pessimism. So he says, no narrative arc of dispossession can accrue to us, and he means Black people. What do I mean by that? Just this. For there to be a narrative arc, the persona in the narrative must move from possession to dispossession to the denouement. That is literally means the resolution of a narrative. That's French, it means the unknotting or untangling. From possession to dispossession to the denouement, the prospect of repossession. Another way of earmarking the points on the narrative arc would be equilibrium to disequilibrium to equilibrium, restored, renewed, and or reimagined. So think of Homer's Odyssey as a classic story of equilibrium to disequilibrium to equilibrium. And we do not get that in the history of Black people to date. And Equiano's work offers that in miniature. The condition of being an enslaved Black person in particular is one that has no particular narrative trajectory. Any moment of happiness can be undone in an instant, senselessly. There's no expectation. And so as you're reading this book, if you find that it's very hard to track the narrative of what's going to happen next, why things go in the order that they go in, it's not because Equiano is an inept writer. The book was very popular in its day, and he made a lot of money on it, actually. But it's because he's accurately representing the condition of being a Black person in the condition of under a regime of white supremacy. So it's the more frustration you feel in reading this in terms of trying to put it together, the more you're understanding how this book is supposed to work. So let me offer a key moment, though, of a transformative element in this, which is the bit about the middle passage. So prior to this moment, when he's describing his childhood in Africa, he describes Africans in a variety of ways because he's on a continent where there are hundreds of different cultures, and he belongs to one of them. And he is enslaved, and he's sold from one culture to another, one culture to another, one culture to another, until he's finally sold to white people. And then that cuts him off from Africa for the rest of his life. Prior to that point, though, when he talks about Africans, he talks about them in a variety of ways. He never calls them Black people, though. I think this is the really important point. So he talks about some of them as being tawny, some of them as being quite white, who he thinks of them as really unfortunate. He imagines some of them as red, or mahogany colored, right? There's a variety of skin colors he's noting. He never calls them Black. The one point he talks about Black people, the very first point, is when he's in the hold of a slave ship. And here's what he writes. When I looked around the ship too and saw a large furnace of copper boiling and a multitude of Black people of every description chained together, every one of their countenances expressing dejection and sorrow, I no longer doubted of my fate, and quite overpowered with horror and anguish, I fell motionless on the deck and fainted. So this is key. Why is this the first point when he describes Black people as Black people? It's because this is how white people see them. White people don't see Africans in their variety. They see them as a giant homogeneous mass, which is produced by white supremacy to transform them all into Black people, right? These racial categories of whiteness and Blackness emerge simultaneously, and they emerge effectively in the middle passage. So what does this actually mean? I want to finish with this bit from Catherine McKittrick's book, Demonic Grounds, Black Women and the Cartographies of Struggle. So she writes, technologies of transportation, in this case, the ship, while materially and ideologically enclosing Black subjects, economic objects inside and often bound to the ship's walls, she means literally chained, also contribute to the formation of an oppositional geography. Oppositional to what? Oppositional to whiteness and to white supremacy. The ship is a location of Black subjectivity and human terror, but also of Black resistance, and in some cases, Black possession. The creation of Black culture emerges here in the middle passage. It's a situation of almost unimaginable horror, but as Catherine McKittrick argues, this is also the chance for these Africans to join together and to band together, where they initially would have seen themselves as different. Now they're forced to see themselves as the same under the gaze of white supremacy. And through that sameness, they can join together and rise up and resist, as we're going to see in the Haitian Revolution, which is the largest and most successful slave revolt of all time. So I'm looking forward to our conversation tomorrow.